My intention is more in this presentation, more theoretical. I start from the question that when we talk about an institution, do we always assume that the institution is the outcome of some political conflict or political cooperation between, generally we assume for labor law, employers and trade unions? In my case, as far as I can tell for this Turkish one, okay, can I move it? Okay. When I look at the Turkish labor law reform in 2003, which is the law number 4857, the law was prepared by labor law professors and who were elected by labor confederations, employer confederation, and the Minister of Labor. And then when I look at the law, the draft they prepared, and when I compared, because normally the societal actors were supposed to not react to it if there's a unanimity between the labor law professors about the draft, there was some reaction from the societal actors. And during the also enactment of this law, they tried to change some parts, and which created a bit of for labor law professors, some inconsistencies, that's the way they call it, in the law, and which could also lead to some unexpected legal interpretations. That made me to think about, maybe I have to go back to history of Turkish labor law and figure out how these labor professors came up with these ideas so that I can understand the way they think, and maybe if possible, which is not an easy task, maybe I can try to separate legal from political. And as a methodology, I went back to the history from the first labor law, which is the big one in 1936, which was a separation of emergence of labor law and its separation from the Code of Obligations, which was much more like a liberal in its understanding. In 1971, we have another labor law, which is not as big, but which is considered as the second one. And the third one is the one that I'm trying to understand in 2003. But since 1950s, there has been a lot of doctrinal debates about certain parts of labor law, which are severance pay and job security, which were used by labor law professors to figure out what the system in Turkey is and maybe how it should be. And in 2003, of course, labor unions wanted it, but they incorporated their own version of the labor job security. And then they also incorporated their own way of thinking about severance pay. And then I'm trying to understand, going back to the jurisprudence, the court rulings since 1950s, and then going back to the debates, doctrinal debates since 1950s, and try to figure out whether I can separate legal from political, and if I cannot, because you might be as a labor law professor ideologically left, but that doesn't mean that you think the same like a labor union or a labor organization. Why? This goes back to, since we have also a German scholar here, Max Weber, when he divided the formal rationality from substantive rationality. When we talk about the formal rationality, imagine that it's a knowledge system which has to be coherent in itself. That's what a law is. It has to be coherent, and those parts which are not coherent, they need to be ironed out over the time, which means that although we assume that the political interpretation of labor law is endless, because our societal actors will try to get as much as they can, but their legal interpretation, more or less, is much more limited than their political interpretation. That's why I will give you just a couple of examples just to get a sense of, because I'm not going to get into the whole stuff, legal debate on severance pay. In 1950s, the main debate in Turkey, doctrinal debate, was which legal idea we can use to understand severance pay. Because if you don't have one legal idea that can explain severance pay in labor law, that means that basically your explanation is, is not coherent from the point of view of the law, but it's more like a political. And then they were trying to figure out what is the legal idea behind severance pay. Is the compensation, is the bonus, or is the job security? And they try to understand all this, and they try to, of course, at the same time, try to understand, interpret the labor law. And one of the ambiguity was around the way labor law was written, the first one, in all terminations regarding workers. This part created a lot of debate. Some of them said that means that it's just the severance pay should be just given when there is a fault of the employer, not the worker. And then but others said, no, 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 we don't see, when we talk about compensation in law, that has to be a fault and that has to be a loss. But when you are getting as a worker severance pay, none of them exist. There's no loss, or you are getting it as a right, as an acquired right. And then the second idea emerged, it should be more like a bonus or award that should be given to the worker for his long or her long service to the enterprise. Then of course, around this time, the first idea was dominant in even the Court of Cassation, the higher court in Turkey. Even the court, it seems like the Court of Cassation even changes opinion towards the second one. But in 1950s, the government realized that this is a very broad definition or broad interpretation of severance pay, because we have to give severance pay to any reasons of termination, including voluntary quitting the job. Then, then they try to limit the intervention of the with the legislative intervention. They try to limit the scope of the severance pay. Another argument, which I'm going to give you, and just to the discussion, legal debate on job security. Of course, labor unions would want job security, and then employers are against it. And there's a long history of it, which I also show. But this part is much more interesting for me because I'm again trying to understand what was the debate. In Turkey, there was a concept in the labor law which is called the misuse of a right of termination. And the question was whether this concept was enough to guarantee a job security for workers. And they realized that it's not, because the Court of Cassation's rulings were giving the Court of Cassation's rulings were basically based on the idea that the employers have the right to fire, and especially as long as they give the notice period, notification, and they give the severance pay to the worker. These ideas, then they try to also understand, is there any use of the reinstatement to work by using this concept? And the Court of Cassation rulings never reinstated the workers back to their job. And then another one was burden of proof relied on the worker, which was very, very difficult to justify your dismissal. And because of these reasons, the labor law professors start to argue that we cannot fix this with this misuse of the concept, misuse of the termination right, because they were using a very abstract, again, it goes back to Max Weber, good faith rules, but it's very abstract, and you cannot set up a job security regime with that. And then because of that, they actually decided, like Germany, they wanted to incorporate these job security provisions into the law so that they specify which reasons count for dismissal, for the termination of indeterminate employment contracts as just, and which reasons don't. Normally, the consensus in the labor law community in the literature is it has to be related to the economic necessities of the enterprise, or it can be related to some disciplinary reasons, but we have to basically limit these terminations so that we can prevent the employer from the arbitrary dismissals of their workers. And this consensus, this is a consensus emerged in 1970s, and this consensus went on till 2003, and they basically adopted a bit of a system like the Germany, that they basically incorporated into their law, that they introduced a criterion for the termination criterion for the specification of reasons for the termination of indeterminate contracts. And but the same labor law professors were also the ones who introduced the flexible employment contracts the Turkish labor law. Then if we say that they are the ones who are ideological left, but actually they also introduced these ones because of the changes, because I'm not going to get into this because I'm just going to use one more minute, because when we think about law has to respond to its changing environment. In 1990s, because when its environment changes, then you, in the court cases, you face with some situations or new legal matters that you have to address them. Then the question for legal professors become, can we address these problems by using the pre-existing legislation and the jurisprudence, or do we need something more? And because of that law, again, even if they adopt flexible employment contracts, that's not, again, the same way the employers would think that they should get rid of all of them or they should minimize their costs as much as possible. Again, I'm trying to separate these two dimensions in my paper, which is ongoing, but this is going to be basically then the 2003 reform was basically along these three criteria: the introduction of additional job security regulations, introduction of flexible provisions, and there was also the preservation of the severance pay scheme in Turkey. There were some debates around it, but that's what I basically tried to show. That will be it.